They found her brushing her hair. 100 strokes, 100 regrets. The brush moved like a ritual, a desperate liturgy of a child pretending to be queen. She whispered something, perhaps a name, perhaps a prayer, but it was lost in the velvet hush of her chambers. The fire had died down. Her fingers trembled near the embers, remembering hands that once traced her face in the dark, now gone, now silent. The crown never fit. Not really. It slid over her curls like a lie too heavy to believe. It wasn't gold, it was lead disguised in flattery. Each jewel a whispered betrayal, each ribbon a tether to the scaffold she had yet to see. The walls of the palace listened more than they sheltered. Behind every tapestry, a mouth. Behind every smile, a knife. And she, Catherine, was too alive, too young, too soft in a kingdom that tore softness apart with its own law. She danced through corridors where others knelt in terror. She smiled too easily. She trusted the wrong eyes. She laughed in places meant for silence. But England does not forgive the vibrant. The court does not forget the sound of a woman's joy. It echoes too loudly. It stains the stone. It makes kings remember their age. So they began to erase her. First in whispers, then in laws, then in blood. She would be dragged in daylight. But her execution began in shadows. Not by axe, not yet, but by the slow, suffocating hands of memory who she was, who she touched, who dared to call her beloved. This is not the story of a queen. Queens have histories. Catherine had only echoes. This is the scream sewn into her bodice, the silence beneath her veil. This is the candle that flickered the night she was told she would die. This is the kingdom that watched, unmoved, as the girl it had crowned became its most beautiful corpse. She was not born for silence, yet silence followed her. It clung to the hem of her gown, slipped into her chambers before the maids arrived, curled beneath the velvet of her bed where no prayers were said. Catherine Howard was not the kind of girl meant to survive a crown. She was the kind men adored too quickly, the kind older women whispered about with disdain hidden beneath pearls. Her smile came too fast, her voice too light, her beauty too careless. She was raised in a house without caution, taught nothing of power except that it came dressed as affection. And so, when affection came again, wrapped in robes and crowned in age, she mistook it for safety. Henry saw in her the illusion of youth, a balm to the rot of his throne. She saw in him the absence of rejection. There was no symmetry in their union, only mutual delusion, the king dreaming of resurrection, the girl dreaming of love. And so began the slow, scented march toward the scaffold, lined with petals and lies. The court smelled of wax and meat, lavender crushed beneath booted heels, secrets steeped in wine. It was a place where windows watched more than they illuminated. Within it, Catherine moved like a flame too close to the tapestries. She wore innocence like perfume strong, ephemeral, always fading. The others watched. They always watched. Her beauty wasn't merely youthful, it was unruly. It did not bow to decorum. It danced in the corridors of Hampton Court with laughter too unguarded, eyes too easily caught by the wrong men. But the court is a creature, and it does not feed on kindness. It feeds on fault. In Catherine, it smelled it instantly, not guilt, but weakness. She was not trained to be still, to be calculating. She lacked the armor of the older queens, lacked Anne Boleyn's sharpness, Jane Seymour's quiet compliance. She was a mirror held up to the king's decline, a mirror that dared to show vitality while his legs festered beneath bandages and his breath turned sour behind closed doors. And for that, she would pay. They dressed her in silk, but watched her with knives. Every compliment she received bore a second edge. Every glance toward her a threat wrapped in courtly poetry. She believed she was loved, and perhaps in some way she was. But love at court is never without witnesses. It is catalogued, whispered, measured, and eventually punished. The king believed himself adored, but what he adored in her was the feeling of being young again. She made him feel less grotesque, less decayed. But he, too, was a thing of ceremony, all flesh and fury, no soul. He brought her to court like a collector displays a delicate relic, not understanding that the relic breathes, remembers, resists. She did not resist openly. That was never her sin. Her sin was remembering a time before the crown, remembering a touch not born of duty. And England does not forgive a queen who remembers. There had been others. Manox with his wicked smile. Culpeper with his quiet ambition names that would soon be etched into parchment and pressed into her nightmares. She did not understand what remembering them would cost. She had spoken of them with the naivety of a girl who believed in second chances, but there are no second chances in palaces built on executions. Only shadows and rooms with walls too thin. The Dowager Duchess had tried to keep her hidden once, locking her away in lessons and locked doors. But Catherine had slipped through like light through stained glass. Bright, broken, inevitable. The court watched as she was drawn closer to the throne. And the moment the crown touched her head, it became a mark of death. She was not trained for power. She was trained for prettiness, for music lessons, embroidery, the art of responding with a smile that said nothing at all. Her laughter was not crafted but spontaneous. And in court, spontaneity is a kind of madness. The other women, draped in modesty and ambition, knew the rules. They had studied the steps of survival. Catherine had not. She was a girl in a labyrinth with no map and no minotaur, only whispers that grew louder behind closed doors. Her body was no longer hers. It belonged to the eyes that followed her, to the papers passed in secret, to the king who gripped her waist with hands that had sentenced others to death. In the mirror, she saw not herself, but a story being written by others. Her face, her laughter, her steps, all retold in voices she did not know, for purposes she could not control. The court did not need proof. It needed narrative. Her story had already been decided, inked in crimson long before the charges would be formalized. She did not realize that every step she took through the gilded halls was being counted, every glance measured, every whispered memory sharpened into a blade. The ladies who surrounded her smiled gently, spoke softly, and betrayed her thoroughly. Their hands adjusted her headdress while writing letters of condemnation. Their mouths told her she was radiant, while their eyes searched for cracks in her composure. And still, she believed. She believed in the softness of love, the return of affection, the safety of belonging. But nothing in the court belongs to itself. Everything is borrowed time, titles, flesh, especially flesh. Henry aged like a fallen monument. His body rebelled, his paranoia deepened. He saw treason in the movement of lips, the slant of a sentence. Catherine became a mirror he could no longer bear to look into, too young, too radiant, too full of reminders. The very thing he loved became the source of his humiliation. Every rumor became truth by royal decree. Every letter folded was a dagger, and still she danced, not with joy, but with the desperate grace of someone hoping not to be seen as prey. But they had already tasted the scent of her fear. The courtiers circled, the clergy watched, the scribes dipped their pens in anticipation. The queen had laughed, had written, had trusted all sins in a kingdom built on silence. Her beauty became her indictment. Her past became her crime. The girl who had once giggled in corridors now walked in silence, watched by guards with cold hands and colder hearts. Her body was no longer her own. Her story was no longer hers to tell. She became property of the tower before the sentence was ever read aloud. And yet, even then, she tried to plead. Not for mercy, for understanding. But understanding is the last thing offered to women like her. The crown does not forgive softness. It turns it into spectacle. The sky darkened early in February. The wind carried with it the scent of decay. She watched from the window, her hands wrapped around the edges of her gown like it could still protect her. She was 20, though time had lost meaning. Her reflection no longer looked back at her. It had turned away, ashamed. There were no more songs, no more mirrors, only silence, interrupted by the slow beat of a world that had already moved on. The queen was no longer queen. She was now a sentence waiting to be spoken. And so they prepared. The carpenters sharpened their saws. The priests rehearsed their prayers. The executioner polished the blade that would kiss her neck like a final lover. Her name was still whispered in the corridors, but with reverence turned to dread. They did not mourn her. They braced for the spectacle. In England, a queen's death is not a tragedy, it is theater. And Catherine, too soft, too trusting, too alive, had been cast in her final role. The girl who wore the crown like a flower now waited for the cold press of steel. The betrayal did not strike like a sword, it crept, coiled, and smothered like the smoke from an unseen fire. It began with murmurs sewn into the hems of court gowns, slipped between pages of scripture, exhaled in the flickering silence between prayers. There was no single traitor. The court itself turned against her, shifting like a forest under snow, each branch cracking under the weight of hidden knowledge. Lady Rochford's lips moved in shadows, her words folding into confession, into condemnation, into the slow unraveling of Catherine's breath. She who once arranged ribbons now rearranged fates, revealing names like cuts opening along old scars. Culpeper, Mannix, 2 syllables, 2 men, 2 ghosts dragged from the shadows and pressed against Catherine's mouth. What had been memory became accusation. What had been affection was carved into treason. The letters were summoned. The rooms searched. The past, long thought buried in the flesh of girlhood, rose like rot from the floorboards. The king, bloated and immobile, demanded truth with the fury of a god choking on his own impotence. And in that fury, he listened not to reason, but to theater. They read the confessions aloud like scripture. They asked questions that were not questions, only openings for guilt to pour through. Catherine, once cloaked in silk, now trembled in linen. Her hands no longer adorned, her eyes wide with disbelief not at the charges, but at the suddenness of the void beneath her. She reached for the past as if it might offer shelter. But the past had already been claimed by men with ink-stained fingers. They wrote her downfall in smooth Latin, in legalese sharpened to a blade. She became evidence against herself, a queen dissected by the very court that had once crowned her with roses. The tower did not come at once. First came the days of silence, of locked doors, of questions she was not allowed to ask. Her attendants changed. Her food grew colder. The warmth of the rooms shifted, as though the walls had been instructed to forget her. When the guards arrived, they were solemn, efficient, faceless. They did not look at her. To look was to remember she was once beloved. To look was to doubt the justice of what they carried. They escorted her through halls she once danced through, now hushed, as if the stones themselves knew not to echo the footsteps of a queen marked for death. She asked if she might write. They allowed it, though the letters would be sealed unread, her words now irrelevant. She asked if she might pray. They nodded, though her prayers would not rise. She asked if she might see the king. This time, no answer. That silence was the verdict. Henry, once captivated by her laughter, now buried her in omission. His face, once pressed against her neck in swollen desire, would never meet her eyes again. She was unclean now, politically infected, romantically dead. The girl who made him feel young had made him feel humiliated. and humiliation must be buried beneath heads on spikes. It was not justice that moved the machinery of her destruction. It was the king's need to sever himself from a memory that made him feel less than sovereign. The interrogations grew sharper, not in volume, but in temperature. Cold rooms, long silences, soft voices asking questions designed not to extract truth, but to encourage collapse. What did he whisper? Where did you meet? How many times did you enjoy it? There was no good answer. Truth was treason. Denial was treason. Her body was no longer hers. It belonged to the court's imagination now. They painted scenes between her thighs and called it evidence. The past became theater performed without her. And Lady Rochford, her once ally, now recited the script with trembling breath. She, too, would fall. But not before the dagger she held pierced Catherine's name. The court needed a witness. Every sacrifice demands a priest. Lady Rochford became both. They say she lost her mind before the end. That guilt rotted her thoughts like mildew on fruit. But guilt was never the point. The betrayal had already succeeded. And Culpeper, he who once slipped into her chambers like a lover stepping into a dream, spoke when it mattered least, whether out of fear, shame, or cowardice. He laced his words with implication, offered no defense, gave just enough blood to satisfy the king's thirst. He did not defend her honor. He did not bleed for her. He handed her name to the fire and watched it burn. The court delighted in it. A queen undone by love, what better entertainment? What better lesson? The scrolls were drawn, the signatures inked. The tower opened its arms. Catherine walked between its walls with the stillness of someone already halfway dead. She no longer cried, not because she had accepted her fate, but because disbelief had calcified into a numb quiet. The same girl who once sang beneath windows now sat mute beneath stone. She had become a relic living, breathing, waiting to be extinguished. The tower held many things, the ghosts of queens, the rust of forgotten crowns, the echoes of footsteps that never truly left. For Catherine, it held memory, the memory of hands she trusted, the echo of her own laughter. The feel of silk turned to ash. She was watched, always watched. The guards changed faces, but not posture. They stood like statues with eyes. The walls spoke at night, though no one confessed to hearing them. She dreamed in fragments of warm sunlight, of ribboned hair, of the king's eyes when they first met. But each dream ended in cold water, in the sound of a door closing, in the weight of unseen hands pressing her toward the block. She was not told when, only that it would come. That was the cruelty of it, not the acts, the waiting, the imagining, the endless rehearsals of one's own end. The court outside did not mourn. It adjusted. The king resumed his feasts. Musicians returned to the chambers. Dresses were chosen for the next queen. There was always another, always a new girl to fill the silence. But Catherine remained, her body not yet broken. Her name still muttered in corners. A lesson, a warning, a corpse in waiting. They allowed her a confessor, a man who saw in her not a queen but a girl undone. He offered her scripture. She asked instead for mercy. He said nothing. The scripture, too, had failed her. They say she asked to lay her head upon the block beforehand, to know how it would feel, a child's instinct rehearsing the end as if practice might dull the blade. They indulged her. She knelt. The stone was cold. She placed her neck against it, closed her eyes, and in that moment, she did not imagine heaven. She imagined a garden, a spring, a boy who once smiled at her without titles between them. Then she opened her eyes, and the garden was gone. Only the tower remained, only the winter, only the slow creak of death approaching. The final betrayal came not from men, but from time. Time stretched, refused to move. It hung in the air like smoke, unbreathable. Every hour was an echo, every silence a scream left unsaid. She did not rage. She did not scream. She waited, and the waiting stripped her of everything except memory. The girl she had been flickered behind her eyes like a flame denied oxygen. No one came. No final message from the king. No clemency. Only the growing hush of finality. And when the day came, it did not begin with thunder. It began with footsteps. Slow, intentional. The kind of steps that do not hesitate because they no longer see a person, only a role. They entered her chamber and did not speak. She stood, smoothed her gown, tied her hair. There was nothing left to say. The guards led her from the room she would never return to, down the stairs, across the stone, to the place where queens are forgotten. The morning was not red with omen nor black with sorrow. It was pale, windless, empty, as if the world had paused to let her pass unnoticed, to let her vanish cleanly. The sky held no bird song, only the low breath of distant bells tolling for no one in particular. Catherine Howard awoke before the summons, her eyes already open, unblinking, as if sleep had finally abandoned her too. Her gown had been chosen, a shade of ghostly white, the kind that neither glowed nor faded, simply hung over her like the remnant of a girl once adored. No jewelry, no veil, no sign of royalty, only the softness of linen where once there had been pearls and rubies. She did not weep. There was no grandeur in her end, only the solemn resignation of a girl who had been emptied of herself long before the blade would come. The room was still, save for the priest whispering words too ancient to comfort. She did not hear them. Her thoughts were elsewhere, scattered across memory like rose petals dropped in haste, the soft thrum of music at court, the whisper of her own name in secret corridors, the coolness of grass between her fingers before she had learned to bow. The world had turned too fast, and now it was leaving her behind. As the guards entered, she nodded once and stood, not with defiance, but with the fragile grace of someone already walking among ghosts. The tower held its breath as she passed, stone unwilling to echo her footsteps, as though even it feared marking her end too clearly. The scaffold had been raised before dawn. The straw was fresh, as if cleanliness might somehow forgive what was about to be done. A black cloth fluttered above, not in mourning, but as a symbol of order. There were no cries, no crowds wailing, only a sea of unreadable faces, men in cloaks, women gripping handkerchiefs, children too young to understand that queens could bleed. Catherine walked with a stillness unnatural for one so young. Her hands were clasped loosely at her waist, not in prayer, but as if cradling the last pieces of herself before they were taken. The executioner stood ready, faceless beneath his hood, holding the blade that had sung for queens before and would sing again. It gleamed faintly, not with righteousness, but with routine. Catherine's eyes met no one's. Not from fear, but from the knowledge that to be seen now was to be remembered as a death, not a girl. She stepped onto the platform as one steps into a final confession, the world narrowing to boards, blade, and sky. The priest offered his final blessings, but his voice was distant, like wind through broken shutters. She said nothing in return. Her final act was not a speech, not a cry for innocence, but a whisper, soft and childlike. As she knelt, I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper. It was not defiance. It was memory spoken aloud, one last time, as if she could anchor herself to something real before vanishing into myth. The crowd flinched. Some wept, others looked away. The priest made the sign. The executioner raised his blade. The air grew impossibly still, and then silence, no scream, no groan, only the soft thump of her body folding forward into history. Her blood soaked the straw like spilled ink, red, vivid, seeping through fabric that had once been sewn in joy. No one moved. No one breathed. The sky remained pale. The executioner stepped back. The guards removed her body without ceremony. Another relic destined for a shallow grave beneath the stones. Her name already a whisper slipping down the tower's spine. There would be no monument, no marble effigy. Only the cold knowledge that another queen had passed into shadow beneath a crown that could not protect her. In death, she was finally still, finally voiceless, finally permitted to vanish. But the court did not forget. It devoured, it rewrote, it sculpted Catherine into what it needed: a warning, a whore, a child, a queen, never a person. Her story was told in fragments, embellished by enemies, softened by sympathizers, rewritten to fit the narrative of power's divine justice. They painted her as reckless, as naive, as sinful. They named her crimes with velvet-tongued cruelty, adultery, betrayal, wantonness, as if she had plotted her own death with each step she took toward sunlight. Yet in every whisper of her shame, the court betrayed its own reflection. For what had she done? Truly loved unwisely, trusted wrongly, lived too brightly in a kingdom that preferred shadows. Her downfall was not in her choices, but in her joy. Joy is always dangerous in places where silence is currency. Catherine's smile had once lit dark rooms. Now it haunted them. In every new queen who crossed the threshold of Hampton Court, her shadow lingered. The courtiers glanced twice. The tapestries seemed heavier, the laughter more forced. None dared speak her name openly, but it lived, stitched into the silence like a curse. For every act of affection henceforth would carry her ghost. Every woman who dared to feel without permission would carry her echo. She had become a myth without even knowing. And still, the blade remained, polished and ready, as if the court had decided that beauty itself was a kind of treason. The legend of Catherine Howard was not one of politics or war. It was a legend written in breath and body. In silences stolen and words never spoken, they say she walks the tower still, barefoot in her white gown, seeking the door she was never allowed to open, whispering names long erased from history, not to haunt, but to remember. She is not vengeful. She is forgotten, and that is the greater cruelty. For what endures is not her voice, but the silence that replaced it. What remains is not her portrait, but the absence in the hall where her music once played. And in that absence, the court continues feasting, crowning, executing, unaware that it is still built upon the bones of girls who died for the illusions of men too afraid to see themselves. Catherine Howard did not die because she was wicked. She died because she was real, and reality is not permitted in palaces made of mirrors. She loved like a girl, was judged like a queen, and vanished like a ghost. The crown she wore rests nowhere. The memory of her scent is long lost. But if you walk the stone paths of the tower alone, in winter, when the air carries the taste of iron and regret, you might hear it, the soft whisper of fabric, the hush of a breath that never got to finish the sentence. And if you do not speak, do not call her name, just listen, for that is all she ever wanted. Not pity, not justice, just to be heard, once as herself. There is no statue for Catherine, no anthem, no relic, no golden scripture to mark her place, only a name carved into dust, fading where the wind has touched it too many times. She was not martyred. Martyrs are chosen, raised, remembered. She was discarded, like a letter never sent, folded too many times to bear the creases. Her blood did not sanctify the stones. It merely sank into them, quietly, like rain that no one noticed. The blade did not weep. The king did not pause. The world did not change. But the silence changed. It grew thicker in the rooms where she once laughed. It settled behind curtains like a second veil. It crept into the mouths of women who learned that joy was fatal, that youth must be weaponized or buried, and still, she lingers, not in portraits, not in stories, but in absence, in the space between footsteps, in the breath held too long by those who remember what happens to girls who do not kneel quickly enough. They say she walks still, not for vengeance, not for justice, but because she was never seen clearly enough to disappear. She walks barefoot, not because she is cursed, but because she never had time to choose her shoes. She walks in silence because they took her voice before they took her life. She walks because someone must remind the walls what they allowed. The tower does not grieve, but it remembers. And in the memory of stone, Catherine is not dead. She is unfinished, a breath caught in winter, a hand outstretched too late, a girl who loved, a girl who paid, a girl who still waits not for rescue, but for recognition. Not queen, not traitor, just Catherine, the girl who was never meant to wear a crown.